Good to see everyone. Hour and 45-minute sermon coming your way. You know, if you go into any courtroom in our country, you're going to hear the words, not guilty. You're going to hear those words, and it's interesting, those words are spoken by people that we know are guilty. And there's been a lot of cases in this country like that, people that have a mountain of evidence against them about the crime, whatever it might be that they have committed, and maybe something as heinous as even murder, maybe something that would put maybe even in that same category, but there's DNA, there's fingerprints, there's all kinds of evidence. And yet, when they're there, it's how do you plead? Not guilty. And we hear that, they enter that plea, and instead of calling it, asking for a plea of guilty or not guilty, I think we should call it mock guilty. Because actually when that happens, and it's just a mockery of guilt when that happens, when we witness those kinds of things in our court. We mock guilt, I think. I think as a society, and again, you know, there's been a few tipping points. I can think of the O.J. Battle and just different things, but it put us in a way as we think as a society and as a culture when we just think about guilt. And I think a lot of us mock guilt. And when we think about guilt, sometimes we talk ourselves into believing that even though we're not, or that we are guilty, we may talk ourselves into that, but it's okay and we shouldn't feel bad about our guilt. And I think that's how we wrestle with guilt. Some events, again, of late have given me this idea about mocking guilt. The wise man says in Proverbs 14:9, he says, Fools mock at the guilt offering, but the upright enjoy acceptance. One of the things that got me thinking about this, and I didn't look it up, I should have pushed a couple of buttons, but I just remember the name Incognito. And the other guy's name was Martin. Remember 3 years back, Miami Dolphins, he was in the locker room, and all the profanity laced with racism and all kinds of different things. And the guy said, you know, I just quit. I'm walking away from this. I don't have to put up with this. And the ones that were doing the text messages and talking that way in the locker room, you know, of course, we're all big pro football players and we're real men. And that's just the atmosphere of the game. And you should just accept that. And that's just the way it is now, and you need to accept that. Now, that bothered me if it had reached that level of acceptance. Yeah, I realize the camaraderie and all the things that go down in different settings. But again, if the guy was guilty of racism or you know, belittling somebody in a way that he shouldn't, but it was never called that. Incognito was never guilty. And I thought about that. And there's just this idea of no guilt. And I don't want to be a part of that. And here's some of the great philosophers of our day, Angelina Jolie. She said this, I don't believe in guilt. I believe in living on impulse as long as you never intentionally hurt another person and don't judge people in your life. I think you should live completely guilt-free. Emily Giffen said, guilt is a supreme waste of time and energy. Janet Jackson said, I'm not a religious person, but I'm spiritual. But I don't believe in things like guilt. Andy Dick said, guilt is a weird thing to me. I don't have a lot of it. If you know Andy, who that guy is, he should have a lot of it. In our society and in our culture, we've just kind of cast this idea of guilt aside. And we mock guilt. We don't want to feel guilty. We don't be guilty about anything. In fact, sometimes even when we own up to being wrong, our apology goes something like this. I'm sorry that you took what I said the way you did, and I'm sorry that you are upset. We don't apologize. We don't confess guilt. We don't admit guilt. We don't go there. And a lot of us are guilty about our own guilt. So I just want us this evening to think for a few moments about guilt and about our own guilt. I want to look at the book of Leviticus, and I know you're thinking, oh no, Leviticus. But I want you to look at a few things here, and I want to talk about the guilt offering and understand what the proverb says when he says that the fool mocks the guilt offering. Leviticus chapter 5, notice what he says, verse 15. If a person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally against the Lord's holy things, then he shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord, a ram, without defect from the flock, according to your valuation, in silver by shekels, the terms of the shekel of sanctuary for a guilt offering. Here's the ram, here's the guilt offering. He shall make restitution, he says, for that which he has sinned against the holy thing, and shall add it a fifth part of it and give it to the priest. The priest shall then make an atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and it will be forgiven him. Here's an unintentional sin. Here's what was involved in an unintentional sin. He wasn't realizing that he was sin, but here he was guilty of profaning and abusing, taking holy things. So you offered a ram. Plus you offered restitution. And by doing that, you were saying you were guilty of unintentional sin. Look at verse 17. He says, now if a person sins and does any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, though he be unaware, still he's guilty and shall bear his punishment. He is then to bring the priest a ram without defect from the flock, according to your valuation, for a guilt offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his error in which he has sinned unintentionally, and he did not know it, and he will be forgiven him. Well, same scene. This guy sins, and he didn't know that he sinned. He finds out later that he's guilty of sin, so he has the guilt of sin, and so he must make that offering, a guilt offering. Then in chapter 6, I want you to notice the first, well, let's just look at the first 6 verses. The Lord spoke to Moses, when a person sins, acts unfaithfully against the Lord, he deceives his companion in regard to a deposit and security entrusted to him, or through robbery, or if he has extorted from his companion, or he has found what was lost and lied about it and sworn falsely, so that he sins in regard to one of the things a man may do, then it shall, he says, be, when he sins and becomes guilty, that he shall restore what he took by robbery, or what was by extortion, or the deposit which was entrusted to him, or the things, or the lost thing which he found, or anything about which he swore falsely. He shall make restitution, for in full, and add in 1/5 more. He shall give it to the one whom it belongs on the day he presents his guilt offering. Then he shall bring it to the priest, his guilt offering to the Lord. What is it? A ram without defect from the flock, according to your valuation, for a guilt offering. Well, chapter 6, here he goes. Here he's taken something from someone. He's guilty of that. You need to go ahead and take care of that. You need to pay that back. You've got the ram. You need to pay that back. Plus, he pays restitution, 20% on top of what he took, lied about it, falsely, all of those things. Now, in all of those things, in all of those offerings, notice that there is, number one, an acknowledgement of guilt. There's an acknowledgement of wrong. There's a sacrifice. There's an offering to God, all right? Then there's an admittance of guilt, an offering to God in exchange, what? For the forgiveness of God. That's the first thing that there's a principle here that needs to be recognized. I need forgiveness of God, need to recognize guilt, need forgiveness of God, and making it right with the person that you wronged. There's the principles that are taught in the old law. But now notice, fast forward to Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah. Now I will tell you that at this time, God did not accept any of their offerings, and there's a reason for that. Of course, they were caught up in idolatry and all kinds of things. I want you to notice verse 11. Isaiah chapter 1, prophet Isaiah. He says, what are you multiplied sacrifices to me? Says the Lord, I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams. Notice that, rams. Guilt offering was by what? A ram. And the fat of fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats, he says. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me, new moon and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity. And the solemn assembly, he says. I hate your new moon festivals, your appointed feasts. They have become a burden to me. I'm weary, he says, of bearing them. God was sick and tired of their offerings. Why is that? Well, because there was no admittance of guilt. They didn't even recognize their guilt. He was sick of the ram offering, the guilt offering, all the offerings. They were caught up into so much, into the lying and the things that they never felt guilty about. God says you need to come clean. You need to recognize your guilt, acknowledge your guilt, take care of your guilt. And even though here they had produced offering after offering after offering, what was it? It was a mock offering because they were mocking guilt. They didn't recognize their guilt. I think we need to be careful. I think all of us need to be careful that we don't mock guilt. That when we're guilty, we need to recognize that. I'll tell you one way that we do that when we mock guilt, denying our own guilt. We deny that we're guilty. You know, the Israelites, they had not admitted their sin. They did not acknowledge they were wrong. That's why God said to the prophet Isaiah, I'm sick and tired of this. I don't want anything. It makes me sick to my stomach, the offerings that they're bringing to me. Because number one, they don't even recognize that they're guilty. And I have to tell you, I think that's sometimes today. And in case the guilt offering there, when you've done something wrong, someone, and you have to pay restitution in that, you're involved in that, you look at that, you're going to say, you know, Terry, I was wrong back there, Terry. I shouldn't have took that. I hope you forgive me. Here you go. Here's 120% of what I owe you. All right? And so you look at that. I have to acknowledge that. But in doing that, I have to come clean about it. And I have to recognize my guilt. And beyond that, please forgive me of that. Forgive me, not only restitution, but I want you to forgive me. And, you know, I think sometimes we take things that are far more serious that we're guilty of, we take them less serious a lot of times. And we just let it pass over. We give it the Passover. It seems that we have a real hard time acknowledging our guilt and definitely offering our apologies for the things that we are guilty of. We don't come clean, I think, a lot of times. You know what? And before, I don't really think I did anything wrong. I know, you know, but listen, I know it's going to be hard, but you can you forgive me? Isn't that a little bit better than, hey, you see what I'm saying? This is hard. I've done wrong. Can you forgive me? Please. We don't do that. Because in doing that, that's a recognition that we're guilty. We're guilty. We are guilty. And we want to look at somebody and we want to say, you know what, it's no big deal. And I know I've done some things, but I don't want you to be upset with me. But really, it's no big deal. Listen, you need to recognize that the one you've offended, it is a big deal. And if you've wronged somebody, it is a big deal. And you're guilty of that. We need to recognize that. We need to humble ourselves. And a lot of times, pride's in the way. We don't do that. We don't even see our guilt for our pride that's in front of us. And we don't see the offense. And we don't see how deeply we might have hurt someone or the violation that we've committed. A lot of times, we have a problem with laughing a lot of stuff off. Man, we laugh everything off. Everything is a joke. Guilt's a joke. Feel guilty? Ha ha. Proverbs 26:18 says, the man deceives his neighbor when he says, I'm only joking. Big joke. Everything's a joke in our society, is it not? I think that applies in a lot of cases. We need to acknowledge our guilt. 1 Samuel, we know the story about, or 2 Samuel about David. And in between 2 Samuel 11 and 2 Samuel chapter 12 is about a year lapse of time there. David has not acknowledged his guilt in killing Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. He has not acknowledged his guilt with committing adultery with her, any of those things. And he's just full speed ahead being the king of Israel. He's just doing what he does, and he continues acting like God's anointed one. There's no guilt. There's no nothing. And then Nathan comes on the scene. And I have to tell you, I don't know if Nathan hadn't came on the scene. If David was just went on with his life until he breathed his last breath, there's no indication that he was going to do that. Nathan called him on that. I'm thankful that he did that because it showed the heart of David. But you know what? A lot of times when people don't call you on it, you just, a day goes by, a week goes by, a year goes by, and you don't take care of the guilt. You don't take care of the wrong. So Nathan comes on the scene, talks about a rich man, a poor man, both had lambs, and the rich man took the poor man's lamb, an only lamb, his most beloved lamb, and he gave it, he offered it to a stranger rather than using a lamb from his own flock. We know the story, and David is incensed about this. Verse 5 in 2 Samuel, his anger greatly kindled against the man. What did he say? He said, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and that he should restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing. He had no pity. And it's not till verse 7 that David gets it from Nathan. He looks at him and says, hey, you're the man. You're the one that did this. And it took that direct confrontation to David for him to realize, I'm guilty. And during that whole time, though, all that time, David was mocking guilt. Guilt, he didn't feel any guilt. And all of those things, I think about that. That's just heavy for me. Now, part of that guilt is that you do have to go to the one that you wronged. But you know what? Think about David. How's he going to right that? How are you going to undo what you killed Uriah? And the adultery, and now the child, and all of those things you look at that, and it'd be difficult. You know, I could steal $100 off Terry. Terry, again, I've been talking about him all day, but he lets me watch his TV. I could give him $120, and we could make restitution, and I could make it right. But you know, the problem is, in all of that, I could make all of that right, but what if I gossiped about Terry? What if I talked about Terry? That restitution wouldn't touch it. You see what I'm saying? The only thing that would touch it would be an honest, listen, here's the money, and you know, while that was going on, I have to tell you, I was wrong. I'm guilty of saying some things about you that simply aren't true, and I was wrong about that, and I want your forgiveness about that. And really, that's about all that you could do with something like that. But in those areas that are harder to deal with than here's $100, in those areas, I'm afraid that we don't want to approach them, we don't want to touch them with each other, our families, or all those, because they're not just like laying the $100 bill and walking away. You actually have to humble yourself, admit wrong, and seek forgiveness. That's hard to do. Now, in doing all that, what are you doing? I'm guilty. I'm guilty of something. That's what you're saying. Also, I think that we can mock guilt when we refuse to forgive the people that are asking for forgiveness. I want you to understand what I mean by that. When you look at that, there's in the principle that's in the Old Testament that we read, there's the offering to God, and then there's the one that's making the offering, and then there's the victim, the one that is receiving compensation. Now, the law did not only allow me or require me to compensate Terry in something like that, but it required Terry to accept my compensation and to accept what I give him back. And it also required him to forgive me. There's a principle there. Sometimes we don't accept apologies. Sometimes when somebody is guilty and approaches us, a lot of times we're in the wrong because you know what? I'll tell you what, they just didn't say it the way you should have said it. You didn't apologize the way I wanted to hear it. And I'll tell you what, really what you did, it goes beyond forgiveness. I'm just not going to forgive you. You don't know how deep you cut me. And I'm just going to let this ride out a little bit. And we think of all kinds of things. And you just don't know how distraught I am about this. And you know, yeah, you're guilty. Yeah, you're here on your knees. But you know what? I'm not ready to do that. Careful. You need to be careful with that. And I mean very careful with that. Luke chapter 17. Because if that's our approach, then I could never forgive that person. I'll tell you what. What's that mean between you and God? Look at Luke chapter 17, verse 3. Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times saying, I repent, he says to forgive him. There's the Lord's words there. You know, if God compares my forgiveness of others to his forgiveness of me, think about that. Guess what? I don't ever deserve his forgiveness. I just don't. I can't deserve his. And yet, I don't deserve, but he gives it to me anyway. He still gives me forgiveness. I don't deserve it, nor do you. But God does. God still gives it to me. So don't mock the guilt of others. Don't mock that by refusing to accept their offering or their forgiveness. Don't mock that. Remember that. You know, I want to warn us about not mocking our guilt offering. I want you to pay attention. The Old Testament, when you sin, and those principles that we read, you had the guilt offering, you had the ram, you had the priest, you had all of those things, and you had the blood spilled, and it was a sin offering, it was a guilt offering, and it was done in a very specific way. But there was blood that was spilled. In Hebrews 9:22, there's no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. We know that. There has to be blood. Now today we don't do that as the Old Testament does, and there's a reason for that. It's what Shane read in Hebrews chapter 9. And I want you to notice there again. Let's go there again. Now, I know, let's look at verse 11. Hebrews 9, verse 11. Now, when Christ appeared as high priest, the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle. It's not made with hands. That is to say, not of this creation. And not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, he entered the holy place once and for all, having obtained, he says, eternal redemption. I know that's speaking mainly in references to atonement sacrifices. But brother, I have to tell you, when it comes to guilt offering, Jesus was that too. Jesus was your guilt offering too. There's no doubt about it. He was in all things the offering to us. And we need to be, I think, careful in our response to the sin in our life about the guilt offering that was made for us. You think about that. You think about the guilt offering. There's no blood like the Son of Man. You think about the blood that was shed for you, the guilt offering that was shed for you. We need to be careful what we think about our guilt. And we need to be careful what we think about our sin. And we need to be careful what we think about our transgression. Because if we don't, we're mocking this. We're mocking the blood of Christ. It's what he says here. And I think that's a powerful thing when you realize that you can be guilty of something that mocks this blood. It's serious business. And I want us to be reminded of that. And I wonder sometimes if we wouldn't be better, you know. There's not enough rams in this world to take care of Jeff Dorton. Can you imagine? Every time I sin, I've got guilt. I acknowledge that guilt. Time to stick a ram. Time to let the blood spill out. Man alive. And I wonder sometimes if we didn't do that physically every time, that I might just back up a little bit on the sin in my life. How about you? If it meant I got to do this ram deal every time, I think I might straighten up a little bit. How about you? But you know what? We're reminded, not by lifting up a ram, going to the priest and spilling blood everywhere, but we're reminded right here. Here's the blood. Here's where we're reminded of not to mock guilt and not to mock sin. Right there. Here's what happened. Right there. Remember that. We're reminded of that every week, every Lord's Day. And I think sometimes we think that because we're Christians, I think sometimes we think, you know what, we're just not that bad. We're okay. You know, there's a guy, and since I don't have TV except when Terry lets me, there's a video, this guy named Ray Comfort. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. And he made quite a few videos, but he interviewed a couple of these college guys, and he said, hey, what happens to you when you die? And both of them said, well, you go to heaven. And so Ray said, well, so you're going to heaven? Yeah, the soul lives on, one of them said. And he said, is that right? He said, yeah. He said, well, what, have you guys ever lied? Oh, yeah, we've lied, but it's no big lies, just little lies, not a big thing. Oh, okay. So you've lied, yeah. Well, have you ever used the Lord's name in vain? Yeah, a few times, but it wasn't any big deal. Well, you know what the Bible calls that? And they said no, and they said, that's a blasphemer. And they said, oh, okay. Well, we haven't done it very much. Then he said, well, have you ever stolen anything? And one of them said, yeah, oh yeah, you know, just small stuff from your kid or something. You steal something like that. And you're still going to heaven? Yeah. So you're a lying, blaspheming thief, and you're going to heaven. Now think about that. What are we? We're forgiven Christians by this blood. Don't mock it. And don't think you're in a position that you don't have to worry about guilt. Because you come here 3 or 4 times a week. You might study your Bible once a month. You might pray to God once a week. Don't think you're covered. Because we're not in the balance deal. You're mocking this blood if you think that. If you're guilty of sin, you need to say, I'm guilty of sin. Don't mock guilt. Don't disregard the guilt. When you feel the twinge, you need to repent to God and ask forgiveness. That's why the blood was shed. But I'm afraid sometimes we think we're okay. And we're just like them 2 boys in college. Oh yeah, I do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but you know what? I'm still going to heaven. And it doesn't balance out. If we go into heaven, if we go there, it's going to be because of Jesus Christ and the offering that he made. Do not mock this offering. Do not mock it. We don't need to treat it lightly. Romans chapter 6, verse 1. What shall we say then? He says, are we to continue in sin that grace may increase or abound. You're going to mock grace? May it never be. God forbid. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? This idea that when we become Christians, we put on Christ, we're washed in the blood, we're immersed, we rise up in likeness of the resurrection, Romans 6, we're a new spiritual creature. When we do that, we are supposed to put away sin. And we're supposed to recognize guilt. And we're supposed to recognize sin. Because when we do, we have to call it for what it is. Stop mocking the sacrifice. Just did it once. Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. The lesson is yours. Let's not mock guilt. Let's not mock sin. Because if we do, we mock the sacrifice, the only sacrifice that's going to save us. Let's put that in our hearts. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. Please come as together we stand and sing.